Hello, it's been a while since we've done anything with CSS, so today I want to look at skinning Foundry. Like we've made the Feng Shui character sheet look distinctly different from Foundry's stock sheets, it's possible to do the same with the whole of Foundry. Get comfortable because this is a long video. If you're in a hurry and feel adventurous, here's the TLDW. Use the console to inspect the various elements of the interface and find out which CSS selectors to override, and set the default font family for the canvas in the init hook. Assuming you're still around, let's do some housekeeping. I'm aware of the Whetstone module for theme creation, but it's more about user customization, which is out of scope for this video. But if you want to make a Whetstone theme, you'll benefit from the knowledge from this video. Also, if all you want to do is change the UI colors, this video will be overkill for you, and you may want to wait until Foundry 0.9 comes out, which will let you change all the colors in one place through CSS variables. I'm going to rely heavily on the work I've done in part 4 and part 1.5, so I'll assume you have watched those. In part 1.5, I described a way to set up less transpiling. People mentioned in the comments that there's a simpler way to do this, and since my previous setup seems to have stopped working, I decided to give this a try. There is a VS Code extension called EasyLess, which will autocompile less files to CSS on save, but with a simpler setup, assuming you've already installed the transpiler. Once you've installed the extension, you can open the workspace settings and in the settings section, add a section called less.compile, then add two settings: main, pointing to our master less file, and out, the location of the resulting CSS file. And that's all you need to do. No more remembering to run a build task every time you start VS Code. Before you start skinning, it might be worth building some convenience functions. Chances are you're going to have different elements of Foundry that you will want to be styled similarly, and you won't always be able to do that with a single rule set. For instance, a lot of my headings are going to be white on a red background, so I have created a function for this, which means that wherever I need to apply this style, I only need to write one line instead of two or more. So I highly recommend doing this. Okay, now on to the main event. I should point out that I'll spend little to no time explaining the various style rules I'm using, as this is likely irrelevant to you. The point of this video is to give you the list of selectors you need to override to get the look you want. So use the chapters to get to the parts that interest you. Following the same pattern as in part 4, I'll create a file called fs2e-style.less and import it in the master file after all the layout files, but before all the sheet-specific style sheets. And just like last time, we'll start with fonts. Setting a font for the body at the very top will ensure that our preferred font becomes the default. Next, I'll give a different font for all the headings. Although this looks like it should affect text on the canvas, that space where scenes and tokens are drawn, it doesn't. That's because we need to set the default font family for the canvas. This is done in the init hook by setting config.canvas.textstyle.fontFamily to the font of our choice. While we're here, we can also add our own font families to config.fontFamilies, which will let users use those fonts in journal entries and set a default family for the system via config.defaultfontFamily. That covers the majority of font selection. We'll do the rest as we go. Now let's work our way counterclockwise, starting with the scene navigation bar and its navigation selector. As is going to be apparent fairly quickly, a lot of interface elements are referred to by ID rather than CSS class. This is why you are going to see a mix and mash of hash signs and dots in the following code. The first element in the navigation bar is the nav toggle, which hides or reveals the list of scenes that can be displayed. The theme here is that I'm going to do that beveled corner thing that is ubiquitous in the character sheet, with that red and white color scheme. Next in the navigation bar is the scene list. Inside, there is the scene selector, which corresponds to each scene visible in the navigation bar. Inside each scene, there is a scene name element, which you can guess what it contains. You can probably get away with just styling the scene selector, but I'm using clip path to make my beveled corners, and this interferes with context menus. So to get the look I want, I need to undo a lot of the styling done in scene and move it to scene name. Note, however, that I'm setting the font in the scene name instead of scene, as doing it in the latter would also affect the font of the context menu, which I don't want. There are 3 flavors of scenes in addition to the normal type, each tagged with a specific CSS class. The active class denotes the active scene, where stuff is happening. All this does is add this target symbol in front of the scene name. The GM class is for scenes that are only visible to game masters. They are identified by having a different colored border and background. The View class, which highlights the scene you're currently displaying, notes that this style supersedes the GM style if you are viewing a GM-only scene. There is a context selector, which may be used to highlight the element for which you're pulling up the context menu. This class is used wherever a context menu is attached to an element in Foundry, so keep an eye on whether the style changes across the interface. You'll note that with the way I've set this up, you can still see that a scene is GM only even when it's being viewed. This is due to the rules for the View selector not completely overriding the rules for the GM selector. Accidental, but I like it, so I'll keep it. Lastly, you'll have the ul.scenePlayers selector, where you can style the list of players currently viewing that scene. I mentioned context menus earlier, so we can look at that next. Pretty simply, you can target this with the context menu selector. This will affect all right-click menus in Foundry. You can use li.contextItem if you need to style each element of the menu, like when hovering over it. Next up, scene controls. These are handled by the Controls selector. Here we have the Scene Controls selector, which corresponds to each button in the first column of the scene control, and the control tool for the buttons in the second column. As all these buttons have a lot in common, we can style them together. Once again, because of my clip path shenanigans, I have to do my styling one level down from where you normally would. That's why I have to deal with those eye elements, but you probably won't have to. Note that some tools are toggles, which you can identify by the purple color. These get the extra class toggle. I'll add something for controlTool.toggle, changing the border color so that these buttons are still identifiable as toggles. Next, we need the active selector for the tool or tool category that is currently active. But turns out the same style is also used when hovering, so we can kill 3 birds with 1 stone. Moving on, we're now onto the players list, handled by the Players selector. The header of this element is an H3, and the list of players is accessible via the Player List selector. Inside that, you have the Player Name selector, with the Self class to identify the current user in the list. Next up, the Hotbar, which displays saved macros. It's divided into 3 parts: the Hotbar directory controls, the macro list, and the Hotbar page controls. The first and third share the same bar controls class, so we can use that selector for the common rules and then use the aforementioned IDs for anything unique to each. Each slot in the hotbar uses the macro selector. It's also tagged with either active if a macro is assigned to it, or inactive if not. The little number in the corner is accessible via macro key, and for the tooltip that displays the name of the macro, you can use the tooltip selector. The next element in the hub is the HUD, which is the stuff that shows up when you right-click on a token, a drawing, or a tile, which are collectively known as placeable objects. We can use the HUD selector for general styling. The HUD for placeable objects uses the placeable HUD selector, but we're more interested in the control icon selector, where we can style all the buttons on the HUD. Don't forget to style the active selector as well. Tokens have some extra elements for the attribute bars, which you can get to via attribute.bar1 and attribute.bar2, both under token HUD. After this, we can look at the menu you get when you press escape. This is accessible with the menu selector, under which you'll find a list named menu items. Then each entry in the menu is an H4 element inside an LI element. The last visible UI element left to style is the sidebar. There is a sidebar selector, but there's a smarter thing to do here. Instead, I'm going to target the app selector because this is also used for floating windows, so that will give them a consistent style. But the elements we've already styled, i.e. the navigation bar, scene controls, players list, and hotbar, are apps too. And in my case, I don't want those to be affected by app styling, so I can exclude those from the app selector. While we're here, let's quickly talk about windows so we can fix this header. Every floating window has the window app class. In there, we'll likely want to override the window header and window content selectors to make sure the title bar is legible and the background is to our taste. Now we can go back to the sidebar. At the top of the sidebar is the list of tabs, which you can target with the sidebar tabs selector. At the end of the tabs, there is a button which you can use for collapsing the sidebar. This has the collapse selector. Clicking on this will add the collapsed class to the sidebar, which you can use if you need to make any styling adjustments to the collapsed sidebar. Okay, with that done, we have two more categories of things left to style: the individual sidebar tabs and windows. We'll start with windows. The vast majority of the windows in Foundry contain a form element and as such share a ton of styling that might be best tackled now. First of all, let's look at the bread and butter of forms, which are input elements. We'll be doing this at the top level for maximum reach, which means I don't really have anything specific to teach you here. The only things worth pointing out are that Foundry has a tendency to give its text fields borders with a radius, especially when the input is in focus. Foundry does very minimal styling to checkboxes, because styling checkboxes is a pain in the bum. The only thing to watch out for is the filter being applied to the check state, as you may want to undo that. Also, don't forget to check that inputs are styled correctly when the fields are disabled. A good place to check for that is in the audio-video configuration settings and the permission settings windows, as they have a lot of disabled fields. Next, we have range sliders. There are mainly two things you'd care about here: the slider thumb and the value displays that occasionally goes next to it, which you can get to with the range value selector. And that's about it for input elements. Next up is buttons. Nothing particularly interesting here either, just make sure the button doesn't react to being hovered over when it's disabled, and that it looks different when disabled. You can see that buttons in forms seem to have extra styling, but we'll deal with that shortly. Next are drop-down menus, aka the select element. Once again, not much to see here. Remember to adjust the styling when the input has focus, as Foundry does its own thing there. And the last form field we need to care about is the text area. You can find an example of them in the macro editor window. But there is a version of the text area that is worth looking into, and that's the TinyMCE WYSIWYG text editor, like we can see when editing a journal entry, for instance. Scanning this takes a few steps. The editor itself can be styled through a series of unintuitively named tox selectors. Tox TinyMCE will let you get the whole thing, while tox edit area iframe will take care of the iframe that contains the edit area. Maybe they are named intuitively after all. Tox toolbar primary points to the container of all the buttons, and tox tbtn to the buttons themselves. I also ended up needing to add some rules for tox toolbar group to space out the buttons a bit. Note I have to use the important keyword here because there's another style sheet that's loaded later and comes overriding my stuff. But these selectors won't affect the actual text you write in there. You might have noticed that the text looks different when it's in edit mode. Without going into too much details, it uses a separate set of style sheets defined in config.tinymce. As you can see here, there's a content CSS array that points to a different style sheet specifically for TinyMCE. As a side note, I should point out this styles formats array, which lets you add custom paragraph styles to the editor if you need that. To customize the look of the text inside TinyMCE, we can amend the content CSS array in our system's init hook to add our own MCE style sheet, which we can create from a .less file as usual. We'll have to amend the EasyLess extension settings as well to generate a corresponding CSS file. Though because different style sheets are used in and out of edit mode, I need to put the actual style rules in a third file that will be imported by both the fs2e-style.less file under the editor content selector and the fs2e-mce.less file at its root. In the interest of keeping this video under 25 minutes, I won't go through all the styling changes for this because you can look at the original mce.css file to see what you need to override. Now that we've styled all the data entry controls, let's look at the form element itself, using the game settings window as an example. We can see that buttons in forms seem to do their own thing, so we'll need to override the styling for consistency. Most form entries in Foundry follow the same pattern. A div with a form group and/or a form group stacked class, which contains a label element, a data entry element of some kind, we've just looked at those, and optionally a p element with the notes class. Some forms, like the default token config window, will have sections delimited by an h3 element with a form header class. Finally, some forms have tab navigation, which you'll probably want to style, though unfortunately the selectors used are a bit inconsistent. Okay, now that forms are done, we can go back to the sidebar tabs, starting with the chat log. Every tab in the sidebar, and its windowed equivalent, is wrapped in a section element with a directory class, which we can use to do some general layout styling that will be common across all tabs. Inside the section for the chat log, we start with the actual chat log, which is an ordered list of chat messages. The selector for this is chat log, which you could use if you wanted to give that chat log a fancy background, for instance. What's more interesting is the chat messages themselves. Once again, there are context menus that clash with my clip path malarkey, but this time I can do something about it. In the init hook, I can change the template being used to render chat messages by pointing config.chatmessage.template to the template of my choice, which will be a copy of the one found in Foundry core. This lets me insert a div between the li element and the rest of the content, allowing me to get my borders without compromising contextual menus. Speaking of borders, when players send messages out of character, the message has a border corresponding to the color of the player as defined in the user setup. The default message template directly overrides the border color style from the HTML. Because I'm doing borders differently, and more importantly because I'm doing them in a different location, I'll have to change this. Rather than changing the style directly, I'll store the border color in a custom property, which I can then read in CSS to alter the border color of the chat message, defaulting to the standard color if not set. And while I'm at it, I will set the message header to the same color as well. Another situation when the chat message has a different color is when the message is private, which is identifiable by the whisper selector. I'll use this to change the background color of the chat message. The other noteworthy selectors for standard chat messages are message sender, message content, and flavor text, the latter of which I have no need to style. But there is one last element of chat messages we need to look at, and that's roll results, which you can grab with the dice roll selector. This is split in three sections: the self-explanatory dice formula and dice total, as well as dice tooltip, which displays the breakdown of the roll. In there you have tooltip part, which contains the part header made up of the part formula and the part total. For each part, there is a dice rolls selector where you have the results of individual dice rolls. And with that, I think we're done with chat messages, but not with the chat application. Next up, we have the chat controls, the area where you can export or clear the chat log and select the type of roll. The latter can be styled through the roll type select selector, which will override some of the styling we've done for the select element, so you will likely need to override the override. Finally, we have the text area where we can enter chat messages and commands, which is accessible via chat form. Once again, you will likely need to alter or undo some of the custom styling that is applied for this specific element. Phew. Now we're done with the chat log. 1 tab down, 9 to go, but the worst is behind us. Let's move on to the combat tracker, which, unsurprisingly, is targeted with the combat selector. This is split in 3 parts: combat round for encounter management, and combat control for turn order management. The last part is the combat tracker selector with the list of combatants, but before we get to this, you'll probably want to add style rules for the A and H4 elements under the encounters class if you want uniform colors across this section. Now back to the combat tracker. We could start messing about in the combat tracker selector, but there is a smarter way to go about this. As it happens, this tab and the next 7 have something in common. They're all what Foundry calls directories, lists of stuff. We've already talked about the directory selector, but below that there's the directory list selector, where we can style all the backgrounds at the same time. Likewise, with directory item, we can style all elements in all directories, which just saved this video from being an hour long. Folders are technically directory items, but they have slightly different behavior, which means I'll need to exclude them from those rules. More on that later. Despite this general styling, the combat tracker still has some custom styling for the combatants, which are under the li.combatant selector. Token name, token initiative, for which the styling is in the initiative selector 1 level down, and token resource. There is also the roll selector for the button that lets you roll initiative, and the combatant control selector for the hidden and defeated buttons, for which you might want to adjust the color. Beyond that, there are 4 additional selectors a combatant might have. Active denotes the token whose turn it is to act. Defeated, when the token no longer takes part in the combat. Hidden, when the token is hidden from the players. And then there's hover, which highlights which token your cursor is hovering over in the scene. We can use the same styling for when we hover over the entry in the combat tracker. And with that, we're done with the combat tracker. Next up, the scene directory. As mentioned earlier, the directory list and directory item selector did the heavy lifting, but if we wanted to further customize the look of scenes in the directory, we could do so via the scenes and scene selectors. One thing to note with the scene directory is that the thumbnail preview for a scene is applied as background image style on the LI element itself, meaning it will override any other background styling you might do. In this case, it effectively prevents me from doing my beveled borders. The scene directory introduces to a few new things. First, we have the search bar, which is inside directory header, itself inside directory, accessible via header search. Then we have folders, which we touched on earlier. Similar to scenes, the folder color is used to directly style the background element, so be mindful of that. With that done, we've already completely taken care of the actor, item, journal entry, and role table directories. Next one is the playlist directory. This is mostly dealt with, but there are some special sections. The main selector for this is playlists. In there, the first thing of interest is global control, holding the global volume controls. As it's collapsible, there is a collapsed selector you can use for situational styling. The header is under playlist header. This might sound confusing, but that's because the global volume control panel uses the exact same classes as the playlist control panel. Likewise, the rest of the section is inside playlist sounds. If we move over to a playing playlist, next to the name of the sound we have sound controls, accessible via sound control, which also takes care of the icons in the playlist themselves. We're now onto the penultimate sidebar tab, the Compendium directory. Not much to discuss here, the selector is Compendium as you'd expect. What's new here is that compendia are grouped by type. So they are bundled in an element you can access with the selector Compendium type. The H3 element has some custom styling, and so does the ol.compendium list, which lists all the compendia for a given type. In li.compendium-pack, you can use status icons if you want to change the color of the locked and visibility icons. In the same location, compendium footer is where you want to go if you need to style the text that tells you the pack's type and scope. Finally, the last tab, the settings. It's mostly buttons in there, so we've already done most of the work, but we'll want to style the H2 elements, as well as the game details selector. And there we go, a fully customized Foundry look. Note that a benefit of skinning Foundry early in the system development process is that since character and item sheets are forms, the skinning might actually give you a head start in sheet styling. I haven't covered every single window, though the work we've done should have covered most of them. The file picker, for instance, could do with some more attention, but that will be your homework. Remember to use the console to inspect elements and check the Styles tab to see which selectors you'll need to override. And with that, this is pretty much everything I have to teach you about Foundry system development. I have one more video planned, but there probably won't be any new Foundry specific knowledge there. I'll just be running you through the addition of a system specific feature as an example of my development process. But it should still be an interesting video. See you there. Bye.